For this curatorial proposition, I have selected 7 films. All of these films belong to very different cinematic traditions, visual styles, treatment, genres, and even language. However, all of them have certain features in common. Firstly, the unglamorous portrayal of violence. Secondly, a negative transformation owing to loss and grief. Thirdly, shifting and unstable power dynamics between the oppressor and the oppressed. Many films portray violent act as courageous and glamorous. Yet the violence is not heroic violence. Rather, it is disturbing and traumatic. For example, in Antichrist, the entire torture sequence towards the end does not have any form of sensationalization. Rather, it makes the audience pretty sick. These films showcases violence as a far-fetched consequences of loss and grief. In Parinati, we see a genuine, honest, kind couple transform into greedy murderers. But where does this grief come from?
कहीं से गड़ा धन मिल जाए तो अभी के अभी सावर जाकर अपने बेटे को वापस ले आओ।
कहीं ना कहीं से किसी तरह धन का जुगाड़ हो जाए तो सच कहता हूँ अपने बेटे को एक छीन के लिए भी बाहर न रहने दूं।
But once they start murdering, they become greedy and addicted to killing and looting. This also showcases how easily corruptible we are. When they finally realizes that they have mistakenly killed their son, they have no choice left but to commit suicide. The violence leads to another trauma, whereas trauma led to violence. This cyclic nature of trauma and violence is very prominent in Sweeney Todd. The transformation from Benjamin Barker to Sweeney Todd is so drastic that at the end he becomes a greater evil than the initial antagonist of the film, Judge Turpin. This brings me to the most crucial point. Be it Sweeney Todd, Badlapur, Antichrist, Parinati, Midsommar, and even in Martyr, all of these characters goes through a negative transformation. This negative transformation is the core of this curatorial collection.
That we all deserve to die. Even you, Mrs. Lovett, even I.
This raises a question: are people inherently evil? In Badlapur, Layak is introduced as this cunning criminal who has murdered Raghav's family. He is the quintessential antagonist. However, as the film progresses, we see his humanness.
मर्डर किया है मैंने मर्डर खूनी हूँ मैं
By the end of the film, he redeems himself and goes through a positive transformation. Whereas Sweeney Todd's nonchalance towards cannibalism, the abrupt moral degradation in Parinati, all hints at the inherent evil tendencies that humans have in their soul and psyche, waiting to come out at a little provocation. Midsommar interestingly illustrates this point through its misogyny. The film's visual aesthetics defies the conventions of traditional horror cinema. Bright sun-drenched landscape, intricate floral arrangement has been juxtaposed against the dark undercurrents of the narrative. This contrast between beauty and horror serves to heighten the sense of unease. The seemingly serene surroundings and polite and civilized behavior of the people mask the cult's actual sinister intention, just like human depravity is often masked by civility. In Antichrist, we see this violent outburst of a woman towards her husband after losing their child. There is a monstrosity in her behavior. In fact, Antichrist talks about the morally ambiguous and brutal nature of nature itself. Coming to the archetypes of victim and the villain, the power dynamic is not static. In the film, Lucy was initially a victim and later becomes an aggressor. We can misread it as gaining power. However, she murders innocent children, could never escape from the ghosts of her past, and ultimately kills herself. Her trauma stopped her from reclaiming her own power, and she always stayed the victim. Whereas Anna, who apparently is powerless at the hands of her tormentor, ascends from her position by letting go of feeling victimized.
Comment on fait pour plus avoir peur? Faut se laisser aller, je crois. Tu crois? Se laisser aller.
In Midsummer, Dani and her friends are the outsiders who have been brought in for ritualistic sacrifice. She is introduced as the quintessential victim or survivor of a horror film. She presents the loss, trauma, and lack of agency in the story. She is on the lower hierarchy of power dynamics. But by taking part in these ritualistic processes of the cult, she slowly gets assimilated into it. Her loss, pain, and anger makes her act questionably at the end of the film, thus get truly accepted into the cult and shift her power dynamic. In Badlapur, Raghav, by choosing not to move on, becomes imprisoned by his own trauma. Layak, through the act of forgiveness, reclaims the power over his own life, even though he ends up in prison waiting to die.
तो ये भी जानता होगा उसने खुद को पुलिस के हवाले क्यों किया? ये अर्जुन अपने सर पे क्यों लिया? तेरे को दूसरा चांस देने के लिए.
Martyr and Badlapur talks about breaking this cycle of trauma and violence. In fact, Martyrs and Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri works as an antithesis to this overarching theme of victim to villainhood. In Three Billboard, Officer Dixon's character arc breaks the pattern, showcasing that loss and pain doesn't have to transform into violence. He starts off from a very violent place. He's racist, homophobic, and bullying. However, the loss of his dear colleague transforms him into a better person. At the end, all of these films talk about the choices we make during difficult circumstances and the character arc we can take. Through these films, we are trying to understand and contextualize the nature of violence and evil, focusing on violence as a consequence of loss.